Today I'll be making French bread. So the first thing we'll be doing is basically prepping the yeast. We have to do this basically to make sure it's alive. So what we'll do is have 2 cups and a half of water, warm to the touch. Sugar, because the yeast has to eat something because it is alive. Make sure it's sugar. If you use salt, then it'll die. And you have 3 tablespoons of yeast. Now what I like to do personally to me is mix it up a little so I know that all the components are be in one spot. Technically you don't have to do that, but I did it a long time ago and I kind of never stopped. Now we'll wait for a little bit for it to start. What we'll do is basically what I would call burping. It would start piling up in a small area in the middle, like it's sort of doing that right now, and it'll start bubbling away or burping. While that happens, we can prep the flour and the salt. In my personal opinion, I prefer to use the salt and flour in the same place for the simple reason of it will make the transitioning from yeast to salt a lot easier and it won't burn the yeast. For this flour, there's 6 cups of it, but I always provide to have more of it on the side for 2 reasons. Bread dough is kind of like, has its own personality. Some don't need any more, some do. And a rare occasion, you'll even need to add water. Okay, so since we are finally at the stage of the yeast starting to burp, we can start mixing our dough, which can be quite messy, so be very aware. So today we're going to be using a standard mixer and with a hook attachment. Makes it a lot quicker and more efficient when you're making it. Always remember to lock it into place before turning it on, because flour will go everywhere. So we're going to start it on the first setting. Always start your mixer in your first setting or it will go wild. Always start by putting a little flour in at first. And continuously add it until you're out. I'll be turning it up so we can keep going. This part is very important to do little at a time, so it gives the dough and yeast some time to absorb the flour, and eventually, if you've done it right, make a dough. Now, every once in a while, you will want to turn it off, unlock it, and clean off the sides so you can get all that flour. So when you grab it, when it's finally done, and make it easier and cleaner in the long run. While that's happening, you might want to try to grab a container of some sort. I'm using a half hotel pan to put your soon-to-be dough in. I like to use oil or butter to lube the area so that in the end the dough won't stick. As we see it's going on now, the dough is becoming actual dough instead of a wet mass. Near the time when the dough is starting to grab off from the sides, you can stop it, and usually you'll know it's done when it's firm, squishy, and tacky, but not wet. Since we finally got our dough in the kind of consistency we want, take out the hook, because you don't want that in your bread. And we'll use that grease pan we had earlier to move it to. Usually, after you're done putting the dough in, you would grab plastic wrap with a little bit of oil or butter to cover it. But today I will be using a paper towel, And then after when you're finally done with that, you will want to put it in a warm space so it can proof. Usually it takes 30 minutes to fully proof. So that's what I'm doing next. So this one has been proofing for almost an hour. Today we're only using half this dough, but for this recipe, technically it makes 2 doughs. So what we do is, once we're done with that, put that to the side, and we're gonna put the leftover flour that was always the additional flour on the table, so we can put the dough on the table so it won't stick. You probably will need more or less flour depending on how much dough you actually have and how sticky your dough ends up being. So since we're doing French bread, we want it to be more like a long bread that almost looks like something you find in the store or maybe in a bakery. What I like to do specifically for this bread is to grab something to roll it out. For this specific bread is usually you would have to roll it out and then bring it back together. Basically, try to make it into almost like a rectangle. As long as wide as you want, But remember how, depending on how big you want it, that's how big it's going to be in the oven. So be aware of that, because we still need to proof it one more time. And it gets twice the size of the bread that it is originally. Usually I've seen so many different ways of doing it, but in my personal opinion, I like the rolling technique. Instead of folding it underneath, you would just roll it into the shape you want. And if it's sticking a little bit, just add a little more flour underneath it as you go. In the end, you'll have a long shape. So usually I tuck in the sides because they never end up looking the best. But if you want this to be longer, I usually find slightly hitting it on the surface to make it a little longer. Once you're happy with the shape you're wanting, you grab a half sheet pan or a full sheet pan to put it on, to put it in the proofer one more time. For 30 to an hour. Always remember to clean your station before you continue. Dirt and grime from the dough. So once your loaf now is done proofing for 30 to an hour, you'll end up with a bread similar to this one. Very big and very long. So what we do with this ginormous bread is basically put the makeup on the face, which that means is basically is the next thing. We are going to make an egg wash using 1 egg to somewhat water. Basically, you break an egg into a container of some sort. Fill it almost the same amount as the egg of water. And then you grab a fork and whisk it until you got somewhat of a base to work with. After you're done with that, you grab a brush of some sort, dip it in, and basically just brush it on. This is important to do this before you skewer it, because sometimes in some baked goods, they end up not tasting great after the end of it. So for the scoring, I prefer to use a paring knife, but there are a item that looks like a bented box cutter that works just as fine. So I like doing designs, but we'll do a normal one today. Cutting the sides of it very gently. It's almost looking like a dough you see in a cartoon. And that's ready to go in the oven. Now for the oven, you need to preheat it to 375 degrees for 20 minutes. And once you're done, in the long run, it might look like something like this. Now, this is a very soft bread. So when it comes out, it'll be slightly firm but squishy. And you'll know it's done when you cut into it and it's fully cooked. And it tastes like delicious bread.